You know, hearing one's biography read in public is a very ominous and humbling thing. You realize real quickly how much time has passed from the days of which it began to the days which are current. And you notice pretty quickly that my early formative years were in the state of Texas. I've pit stopped in a variety of other states. In fact, one of my jokes is I've toured the Southeast Conference on my way to Alabama. However, I want to declare publicly something I say privately all the time. I was Texas born and I was Texas bred. Please, oh God, can I be Alabama dead? That being said, today from First Peter chapter 1, I appreciate Brother Joel reading that passage. I'm just going to focus on verse 6 and 7. And I want to do so from the perspective of a pastor. That would make sense in a context such as this. And even if you're not a senior pastor, from the context of somebody who's in some type of vocational ministry, local church, collegiate-based, whatever it may be. And per that biography, I have a very distinct perspective. One I did not have some years ago that only age and gray hair can bring, and that's the fact that it was 30 years ago this year that I began my first vocational ministry opportunity. So when it comes to 2022, I will actually be rolling into my fourth decade of vocational ministry. And as I read these verses through the lens of 3+ decades of pastoral ministry, vocational evangelism, local church ministry, I've noticed that things are a little different now than they used to be. You know, you get to that age at times where you catch yourself apologizing to your children saying, guys, I know like I sound like the old man here, but just hear me out. I promise it hasn't always been this way. My boys, I've got one that's a sophomore in college. I've got a junior and a sophomore in high school, and they consistently ask questions such as, are you serious you really did not have that when you were our age? I'm like, no, son, it did not exist at that time. But it begins in verse 6 by encouraging us to greatly rejoice. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to pastoral ministry, local church ministry, as I look back on the last few years, I don't know if that's the words I would use. I don't know the adjective of greatly rejoicing. That phrase is something that I would put at the top of my, oh, that's what I feel like doing list. In fact, if you'll allow me to do a little comparison, I want to go back in time a little bit, about 30 years, and I want to look how things have changed. 30 years ago, when I entered vocational ministry, if you look at all the statistics and all the research that's out there, back in the early 90s, we surveyed folks who claimed to be believers in Jesus Christ, had a testimony of being born again, and we asked them this question: how often do you attend or participate in some type of faith expression? Sunday school, worship service, discipleship class, choir, whatever it may be. The average person in your church 30 years ago was 3 times a week. Now that 3 times could include Sunday school, worship service, and maybe a Wednesday night Bible study. Now if your family was like my family, we had a drug problem. My parents drug me to church every time the doors were open, and so we skewed the statistics. In fact, I think there were some weeks around the Christmas season, because my mom was in choir, we hit double digits on some of those weeks. But nonetheless, the average person who claimed to be a believer in Jesus Christ and was a part of your church was there on average 3 times a week. Now, it's 3 times a month. Let me break that down for you. That means that people who are blood-bought, saved, seated in heaven, on average will be in a Sunday morning worship service 18 times a year. Things have changed. It's hard to rejoice when you hear statistics such as that. And then we could talk about baptisms, and I know that particularly on social media platforms, this gets probably way too much static. I won't go through all the numbers, but I guess we would have to agree the trend is not positive among us Baptists. We could get into all the years and this and that, but can I just summarize it? That we are now baptizing the same number of people that we baptized right after World War II. Now, why is that significant? because the population of the United States was half what it is now in World War II. So not only are we having people less frequent our churches, statistically speaking, we're on the wrong side of the data when it comes to impacting and influencing the culture with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if that was not enough, in 2013, there's a man by the name of Dickerson who wrote a book called The Coming Evangelical Recession. Let me give you the executive summary of that book. He told us pastors, ministers, denominational leaders, he said, as we go through the next generation with the trends that are happening, we need to be prepared to do ministry with half the number of people and only 30% of the available dollars. And all of that was before COVID. I don't know about you, but the last 2 years, it's been tough to greatly rejoice. In fact, I'll never forget March of 2020. Remember I mentioned I had a drug problem? I was drugged to church my whole life. In fact, my joke is, I've been a believer in Jesus Christ a little north of 40 years, but I've been a Baptist for almost 50. Because in the womb, I was in a Baptist church. I never thought I'd ever see the day where we wouldn't open the church. I never thought I'd see it. I mean, even if just a few people showed, we always opened the doors. But then all of a sudden, because of a lot of information and voices and such, we didn't. I never thought that Easter Sunday would come and I'd be the only one in the room. Oh, there was a guy on the camera, but he was wearing a t-shirt and shorts on Easter Sunday. I never thought that would be the church at any point, at any time. Easter Sunday comes and goes. And if you'll remember those days about 18 months ago, we were at about week 4 or 5 of all that. And at that point, I realized it wasn't going to change for a while. I have the privilege of pastoring a church that was established in 1859. Now, there's a lot of good and a lot of bad with a church that it's of that age. Can I tell you one of the real intricacies of one of those churches is at some point somebody's written a history of the church. So I went down to the library and I dusted off the history of First Baptist Church of Opelika. I wanted to know if we'd ever canceled church before. The only thing we had to compare was 1918. What we know is the Spanish flu. We'd heard it on the news, only thing we could compare it to. So I went back to 1918 and I discovered something, that 2020 wasn't the first time we'd shut the doors. We shut them in 1918 for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. That was it. 2020, ours were closed for 14. Many of you were closed longer than that, depending on where you were, the situation, the circumstances, and such. I don't know about you, but when you're preaching in any size room to nothing but a camera and nobody else, and it's Easter Sunday, the last thing in your mind is, man, it's time to rejoice. Much the opposite. So how is it in days like this? How is it that even though we hopefully are on the backside of all that we've walked through, still doesn't change the statistics, it still doesn't change the trends. In fact, it's exasperated them if it has done anything. How can we greatly rejoice? Interesting, that next statement says, now for a season. Now that gives me a little hope. I'm a sports guy. A lot of people are, they were a former athlete. I'm a never was, is what I am. But I have an affinity for, I'm a fan of. I just appreciate the lessons that sports bring. And one thing I've learned about sports is a season always comes to an end. Does it not? Now, some seasons are longer than others. And when it comes to the, quote, seasons of life, There are some things that have a season of a few months, some have a season of years, some even have a season of decades. But Ecclesiastes chapter 3 taught me something. It doesn't matter what season you're in, it eventually comes to a close. Every season will end. And so when I look at this passage where it says we need to rejoice, one of the reasons is because what we're walking through, what we've had to navigate, will not always be the norm. There will be a new season. Now, I didn't say it would be a better season. I just said there'd be a different season that would come. Seasonal. And then the next statement, I don't like it. If need be. Is it possible that all that we've gone through, not just the last 30 years, but particularly the last 2 years, is it possible that you and I, as pastors, ministers, denominational leaders, is it possible that looking down from the glories of heaven, God said, you may not believe it, but you need it? You actually need this. Interesting. Because in verse 7, it says that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. The necessity of difficulty, the necessity of trials, the necessity of all that we've walked through that none of us enjoyed, had a purpose. If seen properly, is so that we might become more dependent, more trustworthy on the person and the things of God. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't wish the last 18 months on anybody. But what if we needed it? It's interesting that when all the pandemic began, one thing I failed to mention, it wasn't in the Bible about my boys, is all of them play football. I've got a variety of positions and a variety of body appearances. So I've got kickers, I've got linebackers, and I've got running backs all in my house. And when the school was shut down and the weight room was shut down and everything was shut down, they made an executive decision that Dad and Mom were going to take their cars out of the garage and we were going to turn it into a weight room. That's right. My boys turned our garage into 24-hour fitness right there, anytime they wanted to. And we would wake up to the clanging of weights. I'll never forget, those were restless days for students. Their schedules were messed up, things were different. And any time one of your children is up past midnight in your home, it just makes you nervous. What are they doing? What are they watching, listening? Who are they talking to? I'll never forget, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife, who's a light sleeper, wakes me up and she says, I hear something. Go check it out. I start hearing some noise. I'm thinking, what is going on? I go to my garage at 2 o'clock in the morning and my son is doing deadlifts in the middle of the night. I said, son, have you lost your mind? He said, Dad, I can't sleep. My schedule's all messed up. I figured I might as well work out. I've got weights flying everywhere. I've got machines everywhere. They have turned it into what it became. But it's interesting that according to this passage, we need the difficult things in life because only walking through those do we become stronger. Only walking through those do we become tried and a vessel that is even of a greater appearance. There's a lot of good lessons when it comes to weightlifting. My boys throw a lot more weight around today than they did just a few years ago. In fact, oftentimes I'll get a phone call or a text from one of them congratulating himself and telling me about how much weight they lifted. But none of them started with 300 pounds. None of them started with 250. In fact, if you've ever had the experience of being in any kind of weightlifting program, typically you start with the bar. 45 pounds if it's the big Olympic bar. That's all you got. Can you imagine if all you did was lift the bar? Then all you'd be able to do is lift the bar. See, there's an amazing physiological concept with weightlifting. A lot of people actually have it backwards because when you go to the gym, And in my day, 30 years ago, we called it getting pumped. Now they call it getting swolled. But nonetheless, when you go to the gym and you work out, and if you lift weights, you feel bigger, right? You know what's funny? Is that you actually have not built your muscles in the weight room. You know what you've technically done? Broken them down. When you get in the weight room and you experience any type of resistance beyond that which your body is currently capable of handling, it actually takes the fibers in your muscles and it breaks them down. And then what happens is you give the proper nutrition, the proper rest, and if you allow me to southern ease, your muscles basically say, I ain't doing that again. And they get stronger. And 100 pounds becomes 110, it becomes 120, it becomes 130. And down the road, if you stay consistent and you fight through all those layers of resistance, you get a text message that says, Dad, I bench pressed 315 today. It didn't happen overnight, but it most assuredly happened by a consistent trial and difficulty. See, understand that even in the weight room, we cannot become what we aspire to be if we're not willing to embrace the difficulties. How much more does that apply to ministry? How easily are we tempted, we'll talk about this in just a moment, to take the easy road out, to walk away, to say, I'm not going that path. But it's the resistance, it's the difficulties. I mentioned that all my boys are current football players. We watch a whole lot of football in our house. Doesn't bother me. My wife watches Hallmark in the next room. But nonetheless, we watch a whole lot of football. Let me give you some interesting information in what I like to call the not for long league. It's called the NFL because you're not there for long. But nonetheless, let me give you some stats regarding the NFL. This year, they will participate in the 56th, I think I have the number right, Super Bowl. It's one of the most watched, most attended, most glamorized events on planet Earth every year. We crown whoever that team is the, quote, world champion. Interesting when you start looking at the teams that have won the most Super Bowls. I'll start with the two teams that have won the most. The New England Patriots have won 6 championships. Obviously, there's no Patriot fans here. That's all right. So they've won 6. The Pittsburgh Steelers, we've got a couple of Pittsburgh guys. They've won 6. The San Francisco 49ers have won 5. I'm glad to know there's no 49er fans. And the Cowboys. Now you speak in my love language. Remember, I'm from Texas. The Cowboys have won 5. Interesting that the Pittsburgh Steelers, the New England Patriots, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Dallas Cowboys, those 4 teams alone have combined for almost 45% of all Super Bowl championships. And you start analyzing and saying, what do they have in common? I mean, after all, 2 are in the Northeast, one's on the West Coast, and then one's right down in the middle of Texas. What do they have in common? Allow me to share with you what all 4 of those, quote, teams of great dynasties have in common. They all play their home games in miserable conditions. Miserable. You ever been to Boston in November? It snows, it rains, it sleets, it's windy. There's nothing pleasant about that part of the world in an outdoor stadium trying to throw and catch a football. Just down the road, there's a little place called Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh's the same scenario. Outdoor stadium, snow, ice, sleet, frozen temperatures, all kinds of things. Then there's San Francisco. I know some of you are thinking we're in Alabama. San Francisco's a nice place. You might want to ask Mark Twain about that. Mark Twain said that he spent a summer in San Francisco and it was the coldest winter he ever experienced. My wife and I visited San Francisco a couple years ago in August. Now you remember, I'm from Texas. I live in Alabama. August is hot. But in San Francisco, I had to buy a winter coat just to walk down the street. Windy and cold and wet. And then there's Dallas. It's interesting about the Cowboys. I'm sure many of you are aware that they actually have a new stadium now than they used to have. Do you know they won 5 Super Bowls in that old stadium? They haven't won one in the new one. That old stadium had a big hole in the roof. And by the way, it has nothing to do with God wanting to watch his favorite team. If you want to do the research, it actually has everything to do with the Billy Graham crusade. Go look up the story. Even Texas Monthly printed it. That hole in the stadium means whatever the temperature is outside, the temperature is inside. You ever been in Dallas, Texas, at a noon kickoff in the middle of September? It's hot. The sun's in your eyes. And then because you're in Texas, the weather can change from hour to hour. I've been in Texas Stadium at a football game when it is sleeting. Why is this critical? Because almost 45% of all Super Bowls have been won by teams who spend the majority of their time playing in adverse, miserable conditions. You can hardly say the same about those who play in dome stadiums. Think about the domes. It's always 72 degrees. The turf is always level. A game-winning field goal in a dome, you just kick it down the middle. A game-winning field goal at some of these other places, you might actually have to kick it outside the post for the wind to blow it in. Did I mention the Cowboys hadn't won one in their new stadium? Guess what it has? A retractable roof. All of a sudden, they don't have to face adversity anymore. All of a sudden, if it's raining outside, we can keep it dry on the inside. All of a sudden, if it's cold outside, we can make it warm inside, and vice versa. Interesting that adversity, more often than not, allows an environment to overcome and grow, and the opposite does much the opposite. Notice what it says in verse 6. You need this because of the heaviness through manifold temptations or trials. You know, 30 years ago, when I was new in ministry, I had godly professors and wise mentors who taught me that in ministry, the greatest temptations would be gold, girls, and glamour. Be careful about those areas. They'll tempt you, they'll lure you, and we all know individuals that they have been tripped up by those 3 and sometimes multiple ones of them. But today I want to talk about the temptation that most assuredly at some level you're fighting off. The temptation at some level you've experienced, if not in the last 30 years, I know you have in the last 18 months. It is the temptation to throw in the towel. The temptation to say, I can't do this anymore. The temptation to say, how much more can I handle? You know all those statistics I shared earlier? Same organizations have come back to us and said, let's talk about post-pandemic church. They're telling us that of those who only came 18 times a year, that roughly 30% of them will never show back up again. Yet we're to greatly rejoice. Now remember, it's seasonal and we need this, but this is a temptation. There is a temptation to quit. There's a temptation to give up. There's a temptation to say it's not worth it. Some years ago, I had the privilege of traveling to Portland, Oregon. And this isn't name dropping, it's just I went to school at the feet of Luis Palau for a couple weeks. Luis Palau, one of the most famed evangelists of the last at least half century. And I thought I was going to learn about evangelism techniques. I thought I was going to learn about how to better organize an evangelistic ministry and do local church evangelism and all the things that you would expect. But you know the thing that I walked away with that was most significant from that time I spent with his organization and with him personally? Is he said that in his observation, now remember he's pretty seasoned, now unfortunately deceased. He said in his observation, he said he sees most people leave ministry, quit ministry, throw in the towel within 2 years of God finally bringing them out of that season. And he encouraged me, and I want to encourage you. He said, if you're at the point of quitting, if you're thinking, I can't do this anymore, give it 2 years. Give it 2 years. Do you know the latest data is that only 1 in 10 pastors actually retire a pastor. Now I hear numbers like that and I say, no, who are they researching? Who are they talking to? And then I crossed over into my 4th decade of ministry. And I can name for you more people who have quit than have stayed. I'm not John Bassanio. If you've heard that famous sermon he preached years ago prior to his death, where he listed the 10 names of the individuals that he thought would change the earth the most for the gospel, and his name was the only one that either A, didn't have a gross moral failure, or B, quit the ministry. The temptation is to quit. The temptation is to say, I can't do this anymore. So today, I want to implore you to hang in there. I want to beg of you, when you get that phone call and you recognize the number and you say, here it comes, or you walk into that meeting and you see the countenance on their faces and you think, oh my, am I going to survive this? When you get up on Sunday morning and you question even your own preparation, can I implore you to stay the course? Can I implore you not to give in? Because I've read the children's book, because I had 3 of my own, and the last time I checked, the tortoise wins the race every time. Every single time. Now, one of the great, I guess, advantages, if you'll allow me to use that term, of growing up in the state of Texas is because of the nature of its size and demographics, et cetera. You have a large swath of personalities and such. If you don't know, and if you haven't spent much time in Texas, it's a lot different than Alabama. It is flat, brown, and hot, and that's all it is. One of the things I love about Alabama is it rains. That's a wonderful thing. Now, I know, I talk to Alabamians, they say, man, I wish it would quit raining. I say, whoa, don't say that. And stuff's green here. It's wonderful. But nonetheless, one of the things I've learned about Alabama, other than any other place I've lived outside of Texas, that it has in common with Texas is we, and I use the word we have a fascination with and a love for football. I mean, you speak football and you speak in the language of this state. In Texas, playing football was a rite of passage. Young man who had an affinity for baseball, such as myself, didn't matter. It didn't matter if you played baseball. At some point in your life, you had to strap on the pads because you're from Texas and you're going to play football. Now, due to my lackluster height, I didn't play a whole long time, but I played some. And so everybody I knew at some point in their life as a young man growing up in Texas played football at some point in some level. As I was a young man attempting to play the game, I had a very unique and interesting coach. His name was Coach Kendrick. Coach Kendrick was a native of the metropolis of Muleshoe, Texas. You go ahead and Google Muleshoe, Texas. It's a spot in the middle of nowhere, West Texas. Coach Kendrick enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a young man during the Vietnam era. Served a tour of duty in Vietnam, liked it so much he went back for a second one. He was a different breed. When he showed up on our campus as young men in 7th grade, he had the appearance of an old linebacker, about 6'1", 6'2", probably 250, 260. And that man had a beard that could rival Grizzly Adams. Just a rough, tough Marine Corps graduate. Thanks to the GI Bill, he had gone to college, gotten his teaching certificate, and his very first assignment was a bunch of 7th grade boys in DeSoto, Texas. We learned this together. That being said, we walked through 7th grade, and then we got to 8th grade. Got to the end of our 8th grade season. We had one game left, and just for the sake of accuracy, so you know it's a true story, we were headed to Waxahachie, Texas to play the Indians. One game left, 8th grade. Can I give you a hint? It doesn't count. It's 8th grade. There's no trophies. There's no region championship. There's no MVP. It's just kids learning how to play the game before they get to high school. That week, something very strange happened in North Texas. We had one of those very peculiar ice storms come through. Now, if you've never been in an ice storm in Texas, it's just like Alabama. Ain't nobody know how to drive, that's for sure. And so the ice came in, the roads were covered, and we were being told that our last game in junior high was gonna be canceled. You tell a two-tour Vietnam Marine Corps guy he can't play a football game because of ice. He said, boys, we playing football. He arranged for a bus and a trip that should have taken probably 30, maybe 40 minutes. Ended up taking about 2 hours. I can tell you definitively to this day, and I've been to a lot of places in the world, I have never been colder than I was on that day. We arrived to that meager football field. Remember, this is 8th grade. Nobody cares. In fact, most of our parents didn't even make the journey. The trainer was so concerned. Now, he got concerned with Coach Kendrick a lot because of who he was and how he did things. He was so concerned that we'd get out and play and we'd start sweating and then we'd come on the sidelines that it would start freezing. He made us wear plastic bags over our shoes. Anybody ever played a football game like that? You look ridiculous. And we played the same. We went through the first half. Remember, there is nobody in the stands and nobody wants to be there and there's no trophy to win at the end. We walked in the locker room at halftime. We were losing 21-0. Remember, a bunch of 8th grade boys. Most of us had grown up together. Football was not necessarily the primary sport of all of us, but it was a rite of passage. In the locker room that day, as we waited on Coach to come in, we decided to establish a plan. We were gonna see what we could do to talk him into taking us home. I mean, after all, we're already down 21-0. We can't even feel our extremities. There's no way we can come back. This is a lost cause. Our parents aren't even here. Why are we? So we began to establish our talking points. We didn't know that Coach Kendrick could hear us. We didn't know that he was in the hallway listening to every word. When he walked into that cold, frigid locker room, if I can give you a visual for just a moment, I've given you his size and the aspect of his beard. But as most coaches in the 80s, even if it was cold outside, he wore clothes that were about 2 sizes too tight, if you know what I mean. It just was not a pretty sight. He also had another unique, interesting trait. Before every game, he would take a package, and I know we're Baptists, I know we're in a church, forgive me. He would take a package of Red Man tobacco plug, you know, the one that's like a brick, and he would break it in two. He'd put one half in one side of his mouth and the other half in the other side of his mouth. So every time he spoke, tobacco flew everywhere. So you got this grizzly Adam guy in too tight of clothes, tobacco running down his big old beard. He walks in the room. He says, boys, sit down. I want to tell you a story. Story? I mean, we're down 21-0, we're cold, we want to go home. This isn't story time. That day, he sat down a bunch of 8th grade boys and told this story. The story is 2 boys about our age, identical twins. Had the exact same appearance on the outside, height, hair color, eyes, everything. Very hard to distinguish them. But their personalities could not have been any more different. One of them was what we might call spoiled rotten. It didn't matter what you did for him, what you said, what you gave him. It was never enough. He always complained, he always whined. Nobody could meet his expectation or his standards. And then there was the other one. It's one of those young men that didn't matter what you did, he was grateful for anything. The parents realized they had a problem on their hands. They had 2 completely different perspectives in their house, and so it was approaching the Christmas season. And they decided to do an experiment. They gave each of their boys a piece of paper and a pencil and said, we want you to write from 1 to 10 everything you want for Christmas in order of preference. Well, 2 boys would get excited about that. They began to make their list. They gave it to their parents, and Christmas Day arrived. That morning, they got up excited about the presents and the opportunities of. And the parents announced to the boys, we're going to give you your presents in sections. We're going to go with one and then the other. The one who obviously had the poor attitude said, I want to go first. I want to go first. They said, okay, no problem. So we went in the living room, and there it was. Beginning with number 10 all the way to number 1, everything he had asked for, and every color, brand, etc. What happened? He began to complain, began to gripe, began to moan. They knew they had a problem. The other little boy spoke up and he said, did I get anything for Christmas? They said, son, we did get you something, but it's not on your list. In fact, it's out in the barn. If you go out there, we'll show you what your present is. So they go out to the barn. The other brother's complaining, why does he have to get in the cold? It's not his present. They get out there and his dad said, now son, remember, this is a very special present. He opened the doors, and there in the barn was the biggest, steamiest, fresh pile of manure he'd ever seen. He looked at it, and then he got a twinkle in his eye. He got a smirk on his face, and he dove in. Now the parents are looking at each other like, what is wrong with him? I mean, he's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. Y'all are the best, y'all are the best, y'all are the best. Finally, his dad pulled him off. He said, son, what is wrong with you? He said, oh, y'all are the best parents ever. He said, why? He said, look at all this, Dad, with all this, there's got to be a pony somewhere. Where is the pony? We went out for the second half. Coach Kinder took his clipboard, a lot like Lane Kiffin. He just threw it in the stands. He said, I don't need that. We'd be out there and the play wouldn't go the way we wanted to go, and he would scream, look for the pony. Pretty soon the people lined up across from us like, what is up with your coach? The referees are asking, what's going on? We had a play. We're down, about to score. I played fullback, if you couldn't tell by my size. I played fullback. We ran a sweep, which means I'm not as fast as the guy with the ball, but I try real hard. Nonetheless, we're going around the side. I didn't make my block, hit him in the back, got called for the penalty. Here we were about to score. Coach Kinder pulls me to the sidelines. Now remember, tobacco, anytime he talked. He did something you can't do today. He grabbed me by my face mask very gently. He said, son, you get back out there and you find that pony. You find that pony. I had no idea what that halftime speech would do for this and those other young men. Because Coach Kendrick didn't stop in 8th grade. He got a promotion every year we graduated a grade. Coach Kendrick was our coach for 6 years. Every time we'd go to the next grade, he'd just follow along beside us. But as we entered high school, I and others went to our respective sports of choice, baseball, soccer, whatever it may be. But Coach was always a part of our lives. You know what I discovered? There's a lot worse things to go through life than getting called for a block in the back. There'd be times where a young man that was in that locker room's parents would split up and divorce. Coach Kendrick would pull that young man aside. He'd say, son, you better look for a pony. There were times when we had a young man in 10th grade, lost his dad, unexpectedly, tragic death, emotions everywhere. And I'll never forget Coach Kendrick pulling us aside saying, guys, you better look for that pony. Years later, as an adult, coming back to do a drug awareness seminar at a school that he had now moved to, sees me in the hallway. He says, Meyers, did you bring your pony today? See, it became a phrase of when all looks as wretched and miserable and anything you don't want to be a part of, somewhere, if you dig down deep enough, there is something worth finding. Alabama Baptist, it may not be within the pages of Scripture, but as we walk through this pandemic, as we see the statistics, as we know what the trends are, can I implore you, look for the pony. Look for the pony. Because in the midst of all that, there are still people being saved. There are still marriages being healed. There are still lives being transformed. And don't get me wrong, it's hard to see it, but it's there. And we've got to look for the pony. Now, let me close with the last of verse 7. What does it say? Unto the glory of the appearing of Jesus Christ. Now, if you'll allow me a little biblical freedom this morning, Revelation chapter 19, Jesus Christ shows up, the heavens split, and how does he descend? On a big pony. You hadn't thought about it that way, had you? In the midst of the trials, the tribulations, the struggles, you've all at some point thought about quitting. You've all at some point said, I don't know if I can do this anymore. All of you at some point said, is it time to throw in the towel? Can I implore you to look for the pony? You know why? Because according to verse 7, the reason you do what you do is because one day Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, do you want to be the one who took off the uniform? Do you want to be the one who threw in the towel? Do you want to be the one who said, but it got hard, Jesus? Every day of my life, the last 18 months, I have prayed the last verse of Revelation, please, Lord Jesus, come. I don't want to do this anymore. And so it's not about a football illustration. It's not about two twin boys. It's about the fact that one day, Jesus Christ is going to return. He is going to appear. And I know you want to be found faithful. I want to be found faithful. So until it happens, we have got to look for the pony, not quit, not give up, not give in, not throw in the towel. I beg of you, stay the course, stay in the game. When you get the phone call, when you go to the meeting, when somebody catches you in the hall after the service, we've all been there. When it happens, stay the course. Alabama Baptist, one day Jesus Christ is coming back, and you and I, one day, will get to see that pony. God bless you. Love you. Thanks for allowing me to be here.